Welcome to Sherlock's Casebook, where every mystery has a story, and every story hides a secret. Step into the world of deduction, suspense, and untold cases of Sherlock Holmes. Are you ready to uncover the truth? A visitor in distress. It was a dreary evening in late November when I found myself once more in the familiar warmth of 201B Baker Street. Outside, a relentless London drizzle clung to the gaslit streets, casting an eerie shimmer upon the cobblestones. Holmes, as was often his habit on such nights, lounged in his armchair, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes half closed as he considered some unseen enigma of the mind. A thin wisp of smoke curled from his pipe, adding to the already thick fug of tobacco in the room. "You have been at the club again, Watson," Holmes remarked suddenly, without so much as a glance in my direction. I started. "How the devil?" "The damp upon your trouser cuffs suggests you stepped into a puddle rather carelessly. Yet your boots are not the kind one wears in such weather unless compelled by propriety. The faint scent of brandy lingers, only slightly, mind you, which, combined with the conservative polish upon your sleeves, suggests you spent the evening at your club rather than at home." I chuckled, shaking my head. "Holmes, you never cease to astound me." "And yet," he murmured, "the true matter of interest this evening is not your visit to the club, but rather the footsteps upon the stair." Even as he spoke, a rapid, urgent knock resounded against the door. Mrs. Hudson's voice followed, muffled but insistent. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes. He says it is most urgent." "Show him in," Holmes called, straightening in his chair. A moment later, the door swung open to reveal a man of about 40, drenched from head to toe, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He removed his hat with a trembling hand, revealing sharp features pale with distress. His dark overcoat, though finely tailored, was streaked with rain and mud, and a heavy scent of damp roses clung to his person. Holmes gestured to the chair opposite him. "Do sit down, sir. You have come in haste, and your nerves appear quite unsettled. Watson, if you would be so kind as to pour our guest a brandy." I obliged, and the man took a grateful sip before speaking, his voice quivering. "Mr. Holmes, I have no time for pleasantries. A terrible thing has happened, and I fear I am the only one who understands its gravity." Holmes leaned forward, his keen eyes fixed upon the man. "Then pray, enlighten us." The visitor swallowed hard. "My name is Lord Reginald Ashcombe, and this morning my sister was found dead, clutching a crimson rose in her hand with a cipher scrawled upon her bedroom wall in her own blood." Holmes did not move, nor did he betray the slightest reaction. Only the faintest gleam of interest flickered in his eyes. "Fascinating," he murmured. The enigma of the Crimson Rose Lord Reginald Ashcombe sat with his head bowed, his hands trembling, slightly as he clutched the glass of brandy I had poured for him. The flickering gaslight cast long shadows upon his weary face, accentuating the deep lines of distress that marred his otherwise aristocratic features. Holmes, his sharp gaze unblinking, studied him in silence, his fingers rhythmically tapping upon the armrest of his chair. "Begin from the start," Holmes said at last. "Tell us everything, and omit no detail, however trivial it may seem." Ashcombe exhaled, steadying himself. "My sister Eleanor was found dead in her chamber early this morning. She had retired late, last night, and there was nothing amiss when I last saw her. But at dawn, her lady's maid entered to wake her, and found her lying motionless upon the floor. His voice wavered. Her fingers were wrapped tightly around a single crimson rose, its petals stained with blood, and upon the wall, God help me, there was a message written in her own hand, scrawled in her final moments. "What did it say?" I asked. Ashcombe hesitated, his throat working before he whispered, "3 times shall the flower bloom before the reaper comes." For a long moment silence reigned in the sitting-room. Holmes's expression remained unreadable, though I detected a glimmer of something rare in his eyes, genuine intrigue. "Describe the scene further," Holmes instructed. "My sister lay near the hearth, her nightgown dishevelled, but there were no signs of forced entry, nor any apparent struggle. The windows were latched from the inside, and yet," he swallowed, "her expression was one of sheer terror, as if she had foreseen her own death. Most curious," Holmes mused. "And the rose? Was it one she possessed, or an unfamiliar bloom?" Ashcombe shook his head. "I do not know, but there is something else." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a folded slip of paper. With a shaky hand, he passed it to Holmes. Holmes unfolded it, his sharp gaze scanning the contents. I leaned forward, catching sight of an intricate cipher, a series of numbers, symbols, and letters arranged in no discernible order. "This was discovered within her writing desk," Ashcombe explained. "I believe my sister was trying to tell us something, Mr. Holmes. I fear she knew she was in danger." Holmes traced a long, slender finger along the cryptic message. Then, with a satisfied nod, he folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket. "Lord Ashcombe," he said, rising, "you must take us to Ashcombe Manor at once. There is not a moment to lose." Ashcombe looked startled. "You will take the case, then?" Holmes reached for his coat and hat. "My dear sir, you have just presented me with an irresistible puzzle. The game, as they say, is afoot." The journey to Ashcombe Manor. The carriage rattled through the fog-drenched streets of London. As we made our way toward Paddington Station, Lord Reginald Ashcombe sat opposite us, his fingers laced tightly together, betraying the tension he sought to conceal. Holmes, wrapped in his greatcoat, stared out at the rain-slicked roads, his expression unreadable. "You seem troubled, my lord," I observed, hoping to glean further details of the case before we arrived at Ashcombe Manor. Ashcombe exhaled, his breath misting in the cold air. "I must confess, Dr. Watson, this tragedy has shaken me to my core. My sister and I were never particularly close, but she was family. And this—" He hesitated, his voice lowering. "This feels like something beyond mere misfortune. There was something unnatural about Eleanor's death." Holmes turned to him, sharply. "Unnatural? In what sense?" Ashcombe hesitated before replying. "The way she was found, the rose, the cipher, these are not the marks of a common crime. And then there is the matter of her behaviour in the days before she died." "Go on," Holmes prompted. "She had become increasingly withdrawn," Ashcombe admitted. "At first I thought little of it. Eleanor has always been a private woman. But then she started locking her door at night, refusing to see visitors, and speaking in riddles about unseen forces and omens that could not be ignored. He shook his head. I dismissed it as mere fancy. Yet now I wonder if she knew something, if she feared something. Holmes tapped a thoughtful finger against his knee. And did she confide in anyone? A trusted friend, perhaps? Only her lady's maid, Margaret Crowley, Ashcombe said. She was devoted to Eleanor, and may know more than I. Holmes nodded. She will be the first we speak to upon our arrival. The carriage slowed as we reached the station. We disembarked swiftly, boarding the next train to Berkshire, where Ashcombe Manor stood shrouded in the countryside. The journey was a quiet one. Holmes, deep in thought, produced his pocket notebook and scribbled absently, while Ashcombe gazed listlessly out of the window, lost in his own troubles. At last, the great estate loomed into view. Ashcombe Manor was a sprawling edifice of grey stone, its turrets and ivy-clad walls standing solemnly against the misty backdrop of the Berkshire Downs. A line of tall yew trees lined the drive, their skeletal branches swaying gently in the wind. As we stepped out onto the gravel path, a housekeeper in widow's black hurried toward us, her face ashen. "Lord Ashcombe," she gasped, "thank heavens! Oh, you have returned. There has been another incident, another message." Holmes's eyes gleamed with sudden intensity. "Indeed," he said, stepping forward. "Then it would appear that the mystery is deepening. It is the second message." The housekeeper, still breathless, clutched the folds of her dress as she struggled to compose herself. Holmes, ever the master of controlled urgency, stepped toward her with a measured calm. "Another message, you say?" he asked, his sharp gaze fixing upon her. "Where and when was it found?" The woman swallowed hard. "Just an hour ago, sir. It was discovered in Lady Eleanor's chamber, written upon her looking-glass in the same manner as before. But, sir," she hesitated, her voice lowering, "Lady Eleanor has been dead since yesterday. No one has entered that room since the doctor declared her passing." Holmes's expression remained impassive, but I saw the unmistakable flicker of intrigue in his eyes. "Fascinating," he murmured. Lord Ashcombe stiffened. "This is madness. You mean to tell me that someone entered my sister's locked chamber and left a message unseen?" "It would seem so, my lord," the housekeeper replied, wringing her hands. "The door was locked as you left it, and only you have the key." Ashcombe turned pale. "Then how in God's name did someone enter?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he gestured toward the manor's great oak doors. "I believe it is time we saw the room for ourselves. The scene of the crime. Inside Ashcombe Manor, the air was thick with the scent of old wood and burning hearths. The dimly lit corridors stretched into shadowed recesses, lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors whose oil-painted eyes seemed to follow our every step. The housekeeper led us up the grand staircase, our footfalls muffled against the thick, crimson carpet. When we reached Lady Eleanor's chamber, Ashcombe hesitated before producing a brass key from his waistcoat pocket. With a grimace, he turned the lock, and the heavy door creaked open. The room was cold. An oppressive stillness hung in the air, as though time itself had halted within these four walls. A single candle flickered upon the dresser, casting long, wavering shadows. The bed remained undisturbed, and upon the richly adorned hearth, Dried crimson rose lay exactly where Eleanor had last clutched it, but it was the looking-glass that drew our collective breath. Scrawled across the reflective surface, in a dark, smeared substance, were the words, "The second bloom has come. Beware the third." A shiver crawled down my spine. "Good Lord!" I whispered. "What devilry is this?" Holmes stepped forward, examining the message closely. He produced his magnifying glass, his keen gaze tracing every detail. "This is not written in blood," he noted. "It is ink, hastily applied with a gloved hand. See the inconsistency in the strokes. A deliberate imitation of the first message, yet lacking its desperation." Ashcombe looked bewildered. "But who could have done this? The door was locked, and there are no other keys." Holmes turned his attention to the room itself, his eyes darting from the heavy drapes to the ornate panelling of the walls. Then, with a soft hum of interest, he strode towards the farthest corner, where the edge of an old Persian rug curled slightly at the corner. With one swift motion, he pulled it back. Beneath it lay a small, nearly imperceptible seam in the floorboards. "A hidden passage," Holmes declared. Ashcombe stared in disbelief. "Impossible! I have lived in this house my entire life and never knew of such a thing." Holmes allowed himself the faintest of smiles. "Secrets, my lord, are often buried where we least expect them." He turned toward me. "Watson, fetch a lantern. We are about to uncover what lies beneath." The passage below. At Holmes's request, I retrieved a lantern from the hallway, its warm glow casting eerie shadows upon the walls as we prepared to uncover the hidden passage. Holmes knelt beside the barely perceptible seam in the floorboards, his deft fingers tracing the edges with meticulous care. "Fascinating," he murmured. "The wear on this section suggests frequent use, yet the dust upon it remains undisturbed. Whoever entered this room did so with great caution." Ashcombe, still, pale, hovered anxiously. "You mean to say that someone has been using this passage in secret?" Holmes gave him a sidelong glance. "I mean to say, my lord, that someone within this house knows of its existence." With a final press upon the boards, there was a faint click, and the hidden panel lifted, revealing a narrow opening leading into darkness. A gust of stale air rose from below, carrying with it the scent of damp stone and forgotten secrets. Holmes retrieved the lantern from my hand, and without hesitation descended into the passage. I followed, though with far less enthusiasm, my heart pounding with each careful step. Ashcombe hesitated before bringing up the rear, his every movement betraying his reluctance. The passage was cramped and suffocatingly narrow, its walls lined with aged stone that bore the marks of time. The air was thick with dust, and our footsteps echoed against the damp floor. The corridor stretched downward, twisting beneath the very foundation of Ashcombe Manor. "How far does this go?" Ashcombe asked, his voice hushed. Holmes did not answer immediately. He pressed onward, his keen eyes scanning every surface. Then, after a few minutes of descent, he halted abruptly, holding up a hand for silence. Strained my ears, but could hear nothing beyond our own breathing. Then a faint sound, a rustling, like fabric shifting against stone. Holmes's lips curled into a thin smile. "We are not alone," he whispered. I felt a chill run down my spine. My grip tightened around the revolver in my coat pocket. Holmes raised the lantern, its flickering light revealing the end of the passage. There, half hidden in the shadows, stood a wooden door, slightly ajar. A single narrow gap allowed a sliver of light to spill from within. With careful precision, Holmes stepped forward and pushed the door open. What lay beyond made Lord Ashcombe gasp aloud. A small chamber had been carved into the rock, its walls lined with shelves stacked with old tomes and tattered scrolls. A simple writing desk stood in the centre, covered with scattered papers, ink bottles, and a half-burned candle. But it was what lay upon the desk that drew our attention. A fresh crimson rose. Beside it, another slip of parchment. Holmes lifted it, scanning its contents. His sharp features darkened. "What does it say?" I asked. Holmes exhaled, his voice steady but edged with something I rarely heard, concern. "And the third bloom comes at midnight." I turned to Ashcombe, who looked positively stricken. Holmes set the note down, his sharp gaze flicking towards the darkened corners of the chamber. "We must return to the manor at once. Someone is playing a most dangerous game, and I intend to uncover the final move before it is too late." Shadows at midnight. We hurried back through the hidden passage, our lantern casting long, wavering shadows against the damp stone walls. Holmes led the way with unwavering determination, his keen eyes darting over every surface, committing the layout to memory. As we emerged back into Lady Eleanor's chamber, Lord Ashcombe's breathing was uneven. "Holmes," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "what does this mean? The third bloom comes at midnight. Surely this is some cruel jest." Holmes set the lantern down upon the dresser, his expression unreadable. "A jest? No, my lord, this is a declaration of intent." He turned to me. "Watson, what time is it?" I checked my pocket watch. 11:15. Holmes nodded. "Then, we have just over an hour before we learn what the culprit intends. The question is, do we wait for them to act, or do we force their hand?" Lord Ashcombe sank into a chair, rubbing his temple. "I do not understand. Why these cryptic messages? If someone wanted Eleanor dead, why not simply—" He stopped himself, shaking his head. "No, I cannot bear to finish the thought." Holmes studied him with a measured gaze. "Consider this, my lord. Eleanor was not simply murdered. Her death was orchestrated with great care, planned, staged. The rose, the cipher, the hidden passage, each element was deliberately chosen. We must ask ourselves, why?" The housekeeper, who had been hovering anxiously in the doorway, hesitated before speaking. "Begging your pardon, sir, but there is something else you should know." Holmes turned to her sharply. "Speak!" She wrung her hands. "It's Miss Crowley, Lady Eleanor's maid. She has locked herself in her room. She refuses to come out, sir, and when I tried to speak with her, she just kept muttering that it was too late." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Now, that is most interesting." The maid's terror moments later, we stood outside Margaret Crowley's door. The corridor was silent save for the faint crackling of a candle burning low in its sconce. Holmes rapped sharply against the wood. "Miss Crowley," he called, "this is Sherlock Holmes. I must insist that you open the door." There was no answer. Holmes's expression hardened. "Very well. Watson, assist me." With a nod, I stepped forward, and together we forced the door open with a sharp crack. Inside, the room was dimly lit by a single flickering candle. The maid sat on the edge of her bed, clutching a rosary, her eyes wide and unseeing. She rocked back and forth, whispering under her breath. Holmes strode forward. "Miss Crowley, listen to me carefully. What do you mean when you say it is too late?" She flinched at the sound of his voice, but her gaze remained distant. "The third bloom," she murmured. "It comes at midnight. She told me. She told me." Holmes knelt beside her. "Who told you, Miss Crowley?" She turned to him then, her voice barely above a whisper. "Lady Eleanor." A cold silence filled the room. Ashcombe took a step back. "No," he breathed. "That is impossible. Eleanor is—" Holmes held up a hand, silencing him. His gaze never left the maid's trembling form. "Miss Crowley," he said gently, "you believe Lady Eleanor spoke to you after her death?" The maid's lips quivered. Not with words, but I heard her. The whispering in the halls, the rustling of her gown when no one was there. And tonight— She swallowed, her voice barely audible. "Tonight I saw her shadow pass by my door." A chill prickled at the back of my neck. Ashcombe paled. "This is madness," he whispered. Holmes, however, remained unfazed. He stood brushing the dust from his knees. "Miss Crowley," he said, "someone is trying to frighten you into silence. And I suspect it is because you know something. Something about Lady Eleanor's final days." The maid shook her head violently. "I know nothing." Holmes leaned in, his voice softer, but no less commanding. "Then why are they trying so desperately to keep you quiet?" The question hung in the air like a blade. For the first time, Miss Crowley hesitated. Then, slowly, she whispered, "Because I know what she was hiding." Holmes's eyes gleamed with triumph. "Then I suggest you tell us, before midnight comes." A secret worth dying. For Miss Crowley's breath came in shallow gasps, her fingers tightening around the rosary, as if it alone could shield her from the weight of what she knew. The candlelight flickered, casting shifting shadows upon the walls of her modest chamber. Holmes remained still, his sharp gaze locked onto her trembling form. "Miss Crowley," he said, his voice measured, "if you truly wish to honour Lady Eleanor's memory, then you must tell us what she was hiding." The maid swallowed hard. She made me promise never to speak of it," she whispered. Holmes's eyes did not waver. "Yet, someone already suspects that you know the truth. Do you not see? Your silence has placed you in grave danger. Whoever orchestrated Lady Eleanor's demise believes you hold a key piece of knowledge, and they will not hesitate to ensure that knowledge dies with you." Miss Crowley flinched, her knuckles whitening around the beads in her grasp. For a moment I feared she might refuse, might retreat once more into terrified silence. But at last she exhaled shakily and nodded. "It was 3 nights before she died," she began. "I had just finished setting out her nightclothes when she called me over. She was holding a letter, one that had come by special courier earlier that day. Her hands were trembling, and she looked afraid." I exchanged a glance with Holmes, who nodded for her to continue. "She told me that if anything should happen to her, I was to fetch the letter from her writing desk and burn it. She said it held the kind of secrets that could destroy lives." A chill ran through me. "And did you?" Miss Crowley hesitated, then slowly shook her head. "When I heard she had passed, I rushed to her chambers, but the letter was gone. Someone had taken it before I could reach it." Lord Ashcombe let out a shaky breath. "And you have no idea what it contained?" The maid looked down. "Only that it was written in code. The words made no sense, and yet Lady Eleanor understood them. She kept muttering about the crimson rose and the debt that must be paid." Holmes, who had remained silent through this revelation, suddenly turned toward Ashcombe. "My lord," he said sharply, "how many knew of this letter's existence?" Ashcombe blinked. None that I can recall. Eleanor kept her affairs private. Even I was unaware of it." Holmes tapped his fingers together, deep in thought. "And yet," he mused, "someone knew of its importance. Someone stole it before Miss Crowley could act. Which means this is not merely a crime of passion or convenience. It is a crime of necessity." I frowned. "What do you mean, Holmes?" He turned toward me, his sharp features illuminated by the dim glow of the candle. "I mean, my dear Watson, that Lady Eleanor was not murdered simply to be rid of her. She was murdered to silence her." A heavy silence filled the room. Miss Crowley shuddered. "Then that means the one who took the letter. They will strike, again, won't they?" Holmes gave a tight-lipped smile. "Only if we allow them to." The midnight watch. We left Miss Crowley's chamber with the weight of new knowledge pressing upon us. Holmes led us back to the grand hall, where the great clock ticked steadily toward midnight. Lord Ashcombe, still shaken, poured himself a brandy with an unsteady hand. "What now, Holmes?" he asked. Holmes picked up the slip of parchment we had found in the hidden chamber and studied the words once more. "The third bloom comes at midnight." He glanced at the clock. "In 20 minutes we shall have our answer." I tensed. "Holmes, do you mean to say that the killer will make their move tonight?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Watson, my friend, I should be most disappointed if they did not." Ashcombe's grip tightened on his glass. "What do you propose?" Holmes set down the note. "We wait." And so, in the heavy silence of Ashcombe Manor, we took our positions, watching, listening, awaiting the third bloom. As the hands of the Ayush great clock inched toward midnight, the air in the manor seemed to grow colder, the shadows darker. Then, just as the final chime began to toll, a scream shattered the night, the third bloom. The scream cut through the stillness of the manor. Like a blade, without hesitation, Holmes sprang from his chair, his keen eyes already scanning the dimly lit corridor. "This way, Watson!" he called, dashing toward the source of the sound. I followed close behind, my heart pounding. Lord Ashcombe, still gripping his brandy glass, hesitated only a moment before setting it down and joining the chase. The scream had come from the eastern wing, the part of the house where the servants' quarters lay. As we neared, a door suddenly burst open, and one of the maids, young, pale, and trembling, stumbled into the corridor. "Miss Crowley!" she gasped. "It's Miss Crowley! She's—" Holmes did not wait for her to finish. He pushed past her and into the dimly lit room. A deadly warning. Miss Crowley lay sprawled across the floor, her eyes wide with terror, her lips parted as if she had died mid-scream. One hand was clenched tightly around her rosary, the beads digging into her pale, fingers. The other rested mere inches from a single crimson rose, its petals dark and velvety in the candlelight. Holmes crouched beside her, pressing 2 fingers to her throat. A long moment passed before he withdrew his hand, his expression grim. "She is alive," he announced, though his voice held no triumph, but only just. I knelt beside him, checking her pulse. It was faint, erratic. Her breathing came in shallow gasps, her body racked with tremors. "Poison," I said at once, "but not a fatal dose, not yet." Holmes picked up the rose, turning it between his fingers. "The 3rd bloom," he murmured, "right on schedule." Lord Ashcombe paled. "What does this mean, Holmes? Another warning?" Holmes's eyes flicked to him. "No, my lord, this was not a warning. This was an attempt at silence. The same fate that befell Lady Eleanor was meant for Miss Crowley tonight." He glanced at me. "Watson, can she be saved?" I nodded firmly. "Yes, but I must act quickly. I need fresh water and mustard powder, something to induce vomiting, if we can flush the poison from her system before it fully takes hold." Holmes stood at once. "Then do so. Lord Ashcombe, see that Watson gets what he needs." Ashcombe, though shaken, nodded and hurried off. Holmes turned back to me. "Save her, Watson. She still holds the key to this mystery." I set to work immediately, calling for assistance as I fought to pull Miss Crowley back from the brink. Holmes's discovery. As I tended to the maid, Holmes examined the room with meticulous care. He moved like a predator, his gaze darting from the overturned bedside table to the half-open window. Then suddenly he stiffened. I caught the change in his expression and followed his gaze to a set of muddy footprints leading from the window to Miss Crowley's bedside. They were small, light, too light to belong to a man. Holmes's eyes darkened. "She had a visitor," he murmured, "and not one she welcomed." He bent down, his fingers tracing the edge of a damp patch on the wooden floor. His nostrils flared slightly as he inhaled. "A peculiar scent," he muttered, "faint, yet distinct." I recognized that tone. Holmes had found something. Before I could ask what it was, a weak, raspy voice interrupted. "Holmes!" Miss Crowley's eyes fluttered open. She shuddered violently, but her grip on my sleeve was surprisingly strong. "He knows," she whispered. "He knows you're getting close." Holmes leaned in. "Who?" Her breath hitched. "The one who took the letter." Her fingers tightened. "The one who killed her." Holmes's voice was dangerously soft. "Give me a name, Miss Crowley." A shudder passed through her body, and for a moment I feared she had lost consciousness again. But then her lips moved, forming a single word. "Violet." A stunned silence followed. Lord Ashcombe, who had just returned with the remedies I needed, let out a strangled sound. "No," he breathed. "That is impossible." Holmes's sharp gaze snapped to him. "You recognize the name?" Ashcombe's face was ashen. Violet was my sister's closest friend. Holmes's eyes gleamed with triumph. "Then, my lord, I suggest we pay Miss Violet a visit before the final bloom falls. It's the woman in violet." The name hung in the air like a phantom, its presence sending a visible shudder through Lord Ashcombe. I watched as his grip tightened around the brass railing of Miss Crowley's bed, his knuckles whitening. "Violet?" he repeated as if the very idea was absurd. Holmes, there must be some mistake. Lady Eleanor and Violet Whitmore were childhood friends. She is an artist, a gentlewoman of high society, certainly not a murderer. Holmes, however, did not appear, surprised, and yet my lord, Miss Crowley, in what may have been her final moment of lucidity, named her. Whether or not Miss Whitmore placed the fatal hand upon Lady Eleanor, she is undeniably entangled in this web of intrigue. I finished administering a draught of warm water and mustard powder to Miss Crowley, who shivered violently but showed signs of stabilizing. "She will live," I murmured, straightening, "but she will need time to recover before we can press her further." Holmes nodded curtly. "Then we have no time to lose. We must act before our quarry realizes the game is up." Lord Ashcombe hesitated. "Surely you do not mean to go to Miss Whitmore's home at this hour?" Holmes offered a wry smile. "It is precisely because of the hour that we must go. If she is indeed involved, she will not be sleeping peacefully in her bed. No, my lord, I suspect she will be preparing for her next move. The question is, shall we give her the chance?" Ashcombe hesitated only a moment before nodding stiffly. "I shall accompany you." "That would be unwise," Holmes said bluntly. "Your presence may alert her, and we need her off guard. Watson, and I will pay her a visit, discreetly." With a final glance at Miss Crowley, who now lay in a fitful rest, Holmes turned on his heel and strode toward the door. I hastily gathered my coat and followed. The shadowed studio. Violet Whitmore resided in a modest but elegant townhouse in Kensington, far from the sprawling estates of nobility, yet well within the realm of artistic refinement. The gas lamps along the streets flickered against the damp cobblestones. As Holmes and I approached the residence, "She will not answer if we knock," Holmes murmured. "If she is guilty, she will be anticipating our arrival." I frowned. "Then how do you propose we gain entry?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he pointed toward a side alley, where a narrow passage led to the rear of the house. "Through there," he said simply. I sighed. Must all of your investigations involve trespassing? "Only the interesting ones, Watson." With a resigned shake of my head, I followed Holmes into the alley. We moved quietly, the dampness of the London night settling into our coats. The rear entrance to the townhouse was unlatched, an unusual oversight for a woman living alone. Holmes glanced at me. "She is either careless or expecting company." Slowly, he pushed open the door. We entered a dimly lit corridor, the scent of oil paints and turpentine thick in the air. The walls were adorned with unfinished canvases, stunning works of colour and emotion, yet all curiously incomplete. Holmes moved with practised silence, his gaze sweeping every corner. We had barely reached the main hall when a sound, a soft creak, froze us both. Someone else was in the house. Holmes motioned for me to stay back, then glided forward like a shadow. He paused near a half-open door, listening. I held my breath. A voice, low, urgent, murmured from within. Holmes did not hesitate. With a swift motion, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The sight that met us was chilling. Violet Whitmore stood in the centre of her studio, her pale hands trembling over a large sheet of parchment. Beside her, a tall figure in a dark, coat loomed over her shoulder. His face was obscured by the dim light, but there was no mistaking the glint of a steel blade in his hand. "Put that down," Holmes said sharply. The man whirled, his eyes flashing in alarm, but Violet was quicker. With a sudden burst of motion, she seized a brass candlestick from the table and struck him hard across the arm. The knife clattered to the floor. "Run!" she gasped, but Holmes was already moving. Before the man could recover, Holmes lunged, catching his wrist in an iron grip. The stranger twisted, trying to break free, but Holmes's strength was deceptive. What he lacked in bulk, he made up for in sheer precision. I rushed forward to assist, but before I could, the man wrenched free, shoving Holmes back with unexpected force. He turned, vaulting over a nearby chair, and bolted toward the open window at the far end of the studio. Holmes recovered instantly, but it was too late. The man had already leapt through, vanishing into the fog-laden streets below. Silence fell. Violet Whitmore stood frozen, her breath ragged, her wide eyes filled with terror. The parchment she had been holding drifted to the floor at her feet. Holmes strode forward and picked it up. His keen eyes scanned the writing, and his lips curled into a smile that was both triumphant and grim. "Watson," he murmured, turning the page toward me. "We have our cipher." I looked down. The parchment was covered in an intricate series of symbols and letters, and at the bottom, scrawled in hurried script, was a single phrase: "The debt shall be paid in blood." The cipher unravelled. The weight of the parchment in Holmes's hand seemed heavier than mere paper. The cryptic symbols, the ominous message scrawled at the bottom, "The debt shall be paid in blood." All of it pointed to a conspiracy far deeper than a simple crime of passion. Violet Whitmore, still trembling from the attack, gripped the back of a wooden chair for support. Her knuckles were white, her breath uneven. "Miss Whitmore," Holmes said briskly, turning to her, "who was that man?" She swallowed hard, shaking her head. I don't know. He forced his way in not 10 minutes before you arrived. He said nothing, only that I was to give him the cipher." Her gaze darted toward the parchment in Holmes's hands. "I told him I didn't have it, that it had been stolen from me. But he didn't believe me." Holmes's eyes gleamed with interest. "And yet, here it is. You retrieved it." A flicker of hesitation passed over her face before she nodded. "Yes, from Lady Eleanor's study, the night she was murdered." There was a heavy silence. I stiffened. "You were at Ashcombe Manor that night?" She let out a shuddering breath. "Yes, but not for what you think. I went there to warn Eleanor. I had learned that someone was after the cipher. I told her she had to get rid of it." Holmes tilted his head, and yet she did not. Violet squeezed her eyes shut. She said it was her only protection. She refused to give it up. I left that night without another word, and then—" Her voice broke. "The next morning she was dead." A grim realization settled over me. "And now they've come for you." Holmes, however, was unmoved by sentiment. "Tell me, Miss Whitmore, what does this cipher mean?" Violet hesitated. "I don't know. I only know that Eleanor believed it to be important. She said it held a secret that could ruin men of great power." Holmes turned the parchment over in his hands, his keen eyes scanning the symbols. "Watson, do you recall our discussion of ciphers last autumn? The affair of the dancing men?" I nodded. "A code hidden in pictographs, if I remember correctly." "Precisely. And this," Holmes tapped the page, "eschew a similar principle. The symbols here are not random, they are substitutions." He moved toward the oil lamp, holding the parchment close to the light. The edges of the paper darkened slightly from the heat, revealing faint traces of additional markings beneath the surface. Holmes's lips curved into a knowing smile. "Ah, just as I suspected." I leaned in, astonished. "Invisible ink?" "Precisely. A message concealed within a message." His voice was almost gleeful. "And now, Watson, we shall see what our late Lady Eleanor was so desperate to protect." Using a small vial from his pocket, Holmes dabbed a bit of chemical solution onto a cloth and gently rubbed it over the parchment. Slowly, letters began to emerge beneath the symbols. "Lord Ashcombe, the debt cannot be hidden forever. The crimson rose shall bloom once more." I exhaled sharply. "Lord Ashcombe?" Violet's eyes widened. "That's impossible." Holmes studied the text carefully, his expression unreadable. "Not impossible, Miss Whitmore. Merely inconvenient." A knock at the door shattered the moment. It was urgent, forceful. Violet flinched. "He's come back," she whispered. Holmes stepped forward and motioned for silence. Then, with a swift and deliberate motion, he crossed the room and opened the door. Standing there, his face grim and pale, was Lord Ashcombe. "We need to talk," he said. Holmes stepped aside. "Yes, my lord, I rather think we do. Ashcombe's confession, Lord." Ashcombe stepped into the dimly lit studio, his cloak damp from the mist outside. His usually composed demeanour was absent. In its place stood a man worn by the weight of some great burden. His gaze flickered from Holmes to the parchment still clutched in his hand. "You have it," he murmured. "The cipher." "And Wand." Holmes shut the door behind him. "Indeed, and more than that, we have begun to uncover what it conceals." He gestured toward the paper. "The crimson rose shall bloom once more." A rather poetic phrase for a murder, don't you think? Ashcombe exhaled heavily, rubbing his forehead. "You do not understand, Holmes." "Then by all means enlighten me." There was a long pause. The room was silent except for the faint ticking of a nearby clock. Finally, Ashcombe spoke. "The Crimson Rose," he said quietly, "was not a person, but a society, a clandestine group formed decades ago, during the final years of Queen Victoria's reign. It was created by men of influence, aristocrats, bankers, and industrialists who sought to maintain their power through secret dealings. Watson and I exchanged glances. "And you were one of them?" Holmes asked. Ashcombe looked away. "Many years ago, in my youth, I was invited into their ranks. At the time, I believed it to be a mere social club, a gathering of men who shaped the future of the empire. But in truth, it was built on corruption, blackmail, and even murder." His voice dropped. "When I realized the full extent of its reach, I wanted nothing more to do with it. I walked away." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "And yet, my lord, it seems the Crimson Rose did not walk away from you." Ashcombe's jaw tightened. No, Eleanor knew something dangerous. She discovered a truth hidden within the cipher. I believe she was trying to warn me. His eyes darkened, and for that she was killed. Violet Whitmore, who had been silent until now, suddenly spoke. Then why was I attacked? I have nothing to do with your secret society. Ashcombe hesitated, because the Crimson Rose does not take chances. If they believe you know too much, you become a threat, and threats must be removed. A chill ran through me. Then you're saying that even now, Miss Whitmore's life is in danger? Ashcombe nodded gravely. More than ever. Holmes, however, did not appear concerned. Instead, he tapped his fingers against his chin, his expression one of deep thought. Tell me, Lord Ashcombe, do you recognize this cipher? Ashcombe studied the parchment, his brow furrowing. No, I have never seen this message before. Holmes smiled. Then it would seem Lady Eleanor was far cleverer than we suspected. She did not simply discover the secrets of the Crimson Rose, she created a new one. This cipher is not just a message, it is a key. And the question remains, what does it unlock? Before Ashcombe could respond, another sound shattered the quiet. A.M. Heavy thud against the door, then another. Someone was trying to break in. Holmes moved swiftly, extinguishing the oil lamp with a flick of his hand. Watson, take Miss Whitmore. Stay behind me. I grabbed Violet's wrist, pulling her towards the back of the room. The door shuddered as the intruders forced their way inside. Then, in the darkness, Holmes whispered, "The game is afoot." The final reveal. The door burst open with a crash, and in the dim light of the street lamps outside, I saw two figures clad in dark overcoats surge forward. Their faces were obscured by scarves, but their intent was unmistakable. Holmes, ever prepared, had already anticipated their entrance. With a deft movement, he grabbed the oil lamp from the table and hurled it toward the intruders. It shattered against the wooden floor, the sudden burst of flame causing them to recoil in alarm. "Now, Watson!" Holmes barked. I did not need further instruction. With Violet in tow, I lunged toward the side door and flung it open. Ashcombe followed close behind. The four of us spilled into the narrow alleyway just as a cry of frustration echoed from within the studio. Holmes did not stop running until we reached a waiting hansom cab. With a sharp whistle, he commanded the driver, "Baker Street, and make haste!" The horses lurched forward, and as we sped through the gaslit streets, Holmes sat back, adjusting, his cuffs as though we had merely taken a brisk evening stroll. "Rather uncivilized company this evening," he remarked dryly. Violet clutched her arms. "Who were they?" Holmes glanced at Ashcombe. "Would you care to explain, my lord?" Ashcombe exhaled deeply, running a hand over his face. "Agents of the Crimson Rose. If they were after the cipher, it means they know we are close to uncovering its meaning." Holmes nodded approvingly. "Precisely, which is why we must now deliver the final blow. The final puzzle. Unlocked by the time we arrived at 201B Baker Street, Holmes had already set his plan in motion. He instructed Violet and Ashcombe to remain inside while he worked, and with unwavering concentration, he turned his attention back to the cipher. For hours he scrutinized every detail, cross-referencing texts, decoding the hidden symbols. I could only watch in silent admiration as he worked with a precision that few men alive could match. Finally, just before dawn, he straightened. "It is done." I leaned forward eagerly. "You have deciphered it?" Holmes smiled. "Indeed, Watson, and what a fascinating puzzle it was." He turned to Ashcombe. "My lord, Lady Eleanor did not simply uncover the secrets of the Crimson Rose. She left behind evidence, documents, letters, records of their crimes, hidden in a location known only to those who understood this cipher." Ashcombe's eyes widened. "Where?" Holmes tapped the parchment. "Ashcombe Manor. More specifically, the East Wing, behind the portrait of Queen Elizabeth. A rather poetic hiding place, wouldn't you agree?" Ashcombe inhaled sharply. "My God! It was there all along." Holmes stood. "The Crimson Rose has operated in the shadows for too long. Tonight, we bring them into the light." The fall of the Crimson Rose. With Holmes leading the charge, we made our way to Ashcombe Manor under cover of dawn. Holmes, ever meticulous, had already summoned Inspector Lestrade, who arrived with a full force of Scotland Yard men. Inside the grand estate, Holmes strode confidently to the east wing, and, with a swift motion, pried open the hidden compartment behind the portrait. There, wrapped in aged parchment and bound with wax seals, lay the damning evidence. Proof of bribes, coercion, and even assassinations orchestrated by the Crimson Rose. Lestrade took one look at the documents and whistled. "This is more than enough to bring them down." Holmes dusted off his hands. "Then I suggest you begin your work, Inspector. I dare say there will be a number of prominent figures finding themselves in rather uncomfortable positions before the day is done." A case concluded that evening, as the final arrests were made and the scandal of the Crimson Rose spread across London. Holmes and I sat in our familiar chairs at 201B Baker Street. Violet Whitmore had left for a new life abroad, her safety now assured. Lord Ashcombe, freed from the grip of his past, had vowed to use his influence for good. I turned to Holmes, who sat calmly with his pipe, staring into the fire. "You knew all along, didn't you?" Holmes smirked. "I had my suspicions, Watson. But even I must admit, Lady Eleanor was a woman of remarkable intelligence." He leaned back, exhaling a curl of smoke. "And so, the Crimson Rose has wilted at last." I chuckled. "And what now? Another case?" Holmes smiled faintly. "There is always another case, my dear Watson, but for tonight—" He closed his eyes, sinking into his chair with satisfaction. "Tonight we rest.